The year was 2019, and Pastor Stephen Furtick stood before his congregation at Elevation Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, wearing a pair of shoes that cost more than most of his parishioners made in a month. The red Jordan 4 Retros, priced at $1,500, gleamed under the sanctuary lights as he delivered a sermon about humility and serving others. But those shoes were just the tip of the iceberg. Outside in the parking lot sat his $16 million mansion, complete with a 7-car garage and a private lake. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across America, a troubling pattern has emerged in the very institutions that once stood as bastions of moral guidance and spiritual refuge. The American church, once synonymous with sacrifice and service to the poor, has become entangled in a web of wealth accumulation and political maneuvering that would have horrified its founding fathers. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with subtle changes, small compromises, and the gradual erosion of principles that had guided Christian communities for centuries. What started as legitimate needs for church growth and modernization slowly morphed into something far more sinister, an insatiable appetite for money and influence that has left many questioning whether the American church has lost its soul. Consider the staggering numbers. Kenneth Copeland, one of America's most prominent televangelists, owns 4 private jets, including a $36 million Gulfstream 5. When questioned about this extravagance, he famously justified it by saying he needed to avoid flying commercial because he didn't want to travel in a long tube with a bunch of demons. Meanwhile, his ministry receives hundreds of millions in tax-free donations from followers, many of whom struggle to pay their own bills. But the problem extends far beyond a few high-profile prosperity preachers. In 2018, the Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination, was rocked by revelations of a decades-long cover-up of sexual abuse. Internal documents revealed that church leaders had systematically silenced victims to protect the organization's reputation and financial interests. The cost of these cover-ups, over $300 million in legal settlements and counting. The rot runs deeper than scandal management. American churches now hold assets worth over $600 billion, making them collectively one of the wealthiest entities in the country. Yet food banks run by these same institutions report increasing numbers of church members seeking assistance. The disconnect is jarring. Pews filled with financially struggling congregants, while church leadership enjoys lifestyles that would make Wall Street executives blush. How did we get here? The answer lies in a perfect storm of historical events, theological shifts, and the uniquely American fusion of capitalism with Christianity. To understand this transformation, we need to go back to where it all began. The early American church was built on sacrifice. Puritan ministers lived modestly, often supplementing their income through farming or trade. Methodist circuit riders traveled on horseback through dangerous frontier territories, sleeping under stars and surviving on whatever hospitality they could find. These men and women saw poverty not as a curse to be escaped, but as a virtue to be embraced in service of their calling. This began to change in the late 19th century with the rise of what historians call the Protestant work ethic. As America industrialized, churches started preaching that material success was a sign of God's blessing. Hard work and prosperity became moral imperatives, rather than potential spiritual distractions. The stage was set for what would become the prosperity gospel, though it wouldn't fully emerge for another century. The real transformation accelerated after World War II. America's post-war economic boom coincided with a religious revival that saw church membership soar. Suddenly, congregations had money, lots of it. They built bigger sanctuaries, hired more staff, and expanded their programs. Initially, much of this growth served legitimate purposes, reaching more people, serving communities better, and adapting to a rapidly changing society. But success bred ambition, and ambition bred compromise. Churches that had once prided themselves on simplicity began competing with each other for members, money, and influence. The marketplace dynamics that drove American business started seeping into church culture. Pastors became CEOs, congregations became customer bases, and salvation became a product to be marketed. Hello, history enthusiasts. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shaped our world. If you're new here, we explore the hidden narratives behind major historical events and social transformations. I'm curious, where are you watching from today, and what time is it where you are? Are you a student, a professional, or perhaps someone in church leadership yourself? Drop your answers in the comments below. I love hearing from our global community. The 1980s marked a turning point with the rise of the televangelists. Men like Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart, and Oral Roberts perfected the art of mass-market religion. They discovered that television could bypass traditional church hierarchies and appeal directly to believers' wallets. The formula was simple: dramatic testimonies, emotional appeals, and the promise that donations would result in divine financial blessings. Jim Bakker's PTL Club epitomized this new approach. At its peak, the ministry raised over $150 million annually, while Bakker and his wife Tammy Faye lived in luxury that included gold-plated bathroom fixtures and an air-conditioned doghouse. When the empire finally collapsed in 1987 amid fraud charges and scandal, it revealed the extent to which money had corrupted the ministry's mission. Bakker had been selling lifetime partnerships to a Christian resort that could never accommodate all the people who had paid for them. A religious Ponzi scheme that defrauded thousands of faithful believers. The Baker scandal should have served as a warning, but instead it became a template for more sophisticated operations. The lesson learned wasn't that prosperity preaching was wrong, but that it needed better public relations and legal protection. Enter the modern megachurch movement. Beginning in the 1990s, churches started growing to unprecedented sizes, with some congregations exceeding 50,000 members. These religious corporations, because that's effectively what they became, required massive infrastructure, professional management, and sophisticated marketing strategies. Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church in Houston perfectly exemplifies this evolution. Housed in a former sports arena that cost over $100 million to renovate, the church attracts 43,000 attendees each week. Osteen himself has never taken a salary from the church, instead earning millions from book sales and speaking engagements that his church position makes possible. It's a brilliant financial arrangement that maintains the appearance of pastoral humility while generating enormous personal wealth. But the megachurch model created new problems. These massive institutions required constant growth to sustain their operations, leading to increasingly aggressive fundraising tactics. Congregants were pressured to make large donations, often beyond their means. The prosperity gospel provided theological justification for this pressure. God wanted believers to be wealthy, but first they had to demonstrate faith through generous giving. The psychological manipulation became sophisticated. Churches hired marketing firms to develop stewardship campaigns that used emotional manipulation, peer pressure, and guilt to increase donations. Members were asked to make faith pledges based not on their current income, but on what they believed God would provide if they demonstrated sufficient faith. Those who couldn't meet their pledges were often shamed publicly or excluded from church leadership. The integration of politics further corrupted the American church's mission. Beginning in the 1970s with the rise of the moral majority, church leaders discovered that political involvement could provide access to power and influence far beyond their congregations. Tax-exempt religious organizations began skirting the edges of political endorsement laws, using their platforms to support specific candidates and policies. This political engagement came with a price. Churches found themselves beholden to political donors and special interests. The National Rifle Association, for example, has donated millions to Christian organizations, influencing their positions on gun control despite biblical teachings about peace and nonviolence. Similarly, fossil fuel companies have funded Christian groups to oppose environmental regulations, creating the bizarre spectacle of churches arguing against caring for God's creation. The Trump presidency exposed the extent of this corruption. 81% of white evangelical Christians voted for a candidate whose personal behavior and business practices contradicted every traditional Christian value. The explanation wasn't theological, but transactional. Trump promised to protect churches' tax exemptions, allow political endorsements from pulpits, and appoint conservative judges. In exchange, church leaders provided unwavering support, even when that support required abandoning their stated moral principles. Perhaps nowhere is this corruption more visible than in the prosperity gospel movement's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As millions of Americans faced unemployment and financial hardship, prominent preachers continued demanding donations for their luxury lifestyles. Kenneth Copeland claimed he could blow the virus away with the wind of God, while continuing to fly in his private jets. Jesse Duplantis asked his followers to donate money for a $54 million private jet, arguing that God had told him he needed it to spread the gospel more effectively. The pandemic also revealed the extent to which churches had become dependent on continuous cash flow to maintain their operations. When lockdowns prevented in-person services, many churches faced immediate financial crises despite having received millions in donations over the years. The money hadn't been saved or invested in community service. It had been spent on salaries, buildings, and lifestyle expenses that provided no buffer for challenging times. Yet perhaps the most damaging aspect of money's influence on American churches has been its impact on their core mission, serving the poor and marginalized. Churches that once operated soup kitchens, homeless shelters, and community programs increasingly view these activities as costly distractions from their primary business of attracting affluent members. A 2019 study found that churches in wealthy neighborhoods spend less than 2% of their budgets on community outreach, while churches in poor neighborhoods, despite having far fewer resources, spend over 15%. The inversion is striking. Those with the most give the least, while those with the least give the most. This pattern directly contradicts Jesus' teachings about wealth and service, but it perfectly aligns with business principles about maximizing profit margins. The tax implications of church wealth have also become controversial. American churches are exempt from most federal taxes, a privilege originally granted because of their charitable work and community service. However, modern megachurches operate more like entertainment companies or motivational speaking businesses than traditional charitable organizations. They sell books, merchandise, and experiences while using their tax-exempt status to accumulate wealth that benefits primarily their leadership. Consider the case of Ed Young Jr., pastor of Fellowship Church in Texas. His church owns a ranch worth over $5 million where Young lives rent-free. The church also provides him with luxury cars and covers his personal expenses, all while maintaining tax-exempt status. When challenged about this arrangement, Young argued that his lifestyle was necessary to attract successful people to the church. A remarkable admission that the gospel's appeal depends on the pastor's material wealth rather than its spiritual truth. The influence of corporate culture on church governance has created additional problems. Many churches now operate with corporate-style boards dominated by wealthy donors rather than spiritual leaders. These boards make decisions based on financial considerations rather than biblical principles, leading to policies that prioritize donor preferences over community needs. This corporate influence extends to pastor selection. Many churches now hire pastors based on their ability to raise funds and attract affluent members, rather than their theological training or spiritual maturity. The result is a generation of church leaders who are essentially religious entrepreneurs, skilled at marketing and fundraising, but often lacking in the pastoral care and biblical scholarship that once defined ministry. The corruption has even infected theological education. Seminary students now take courses in church marketing, fundraising strategies, and business management alongside traditional biblical studies. While some business skills may be necessary for modern church administration, the emphasis has shifted dramatically from spiritual formation to financial success. The student debt crisis has also influenced pastoral motivations. Many seminary graduates face crushing educational debt that pressures them to seek high-paying positions in large churches rather than serving in smaller, needier communities. The result is a brain drain that leaves poor and rural congregations without qualified leadership, while wealthy suburban churches compete for celebrity pastors with increasingly expensive compensation packages. Women in ministry face additional challenges related to money and power. Despite representing a growing percentage of seminary graduates, women pastors typically earn significantly less than their male counterparts and are more likely to serve in smaller, less wealthy congregations. This disparity reflects not just gender bias, but the church's increasing focus on financial success over spiritual calling. The international implications of American church corruption have been devastating for Christian witness worldwide. American prosperity preachers have exported their theology to developing countries, where impoverished believers are encouraged to donate money they desperately need to American ministries that promise divine financial returns. This modern form of religious colonialism has damaged Christianity's reputation and credibility in regions where it was once a source of hope and social justice. African and Latin American theologians have sharply criticized American prosperity theology as a betrayal of Christian principles and a form of economic exploitation. They point out that Jesus explicitly warned against the pursuit of wealth and consistently sided with the poor against the rich. The American church's transformation into a wealth accumulation machine contradicts not just Christian tradition, but the explicit teachings of its founder. The rise of Christian nationalism has added another troubling dimension to the money and power corruption. Wealthy donors have funded Christian organizations that promote the idea that America is divinely ordained as a Christian nation, deserving of special blessing and protection. This theology justifies aggressive foreign policies, environmental destruction, and economic inequality as expressions of God's will, rather than human greed and short-sightedness. The psychological toll on ordinary believers has been severe. Many Christians report feeling disillusioned and betrayed by their church's focus on money and politics. Mental health professionals note increasing rates of religious trauma among people who have left churches due to financial manipulation or abuse of power. The very institutions that should provide comfort and guidance in times of trouble have become sources of stress and exploitation. Young people have been particularly affected by this corruption. Survey data shows that younger Americans are leaving organized religion at unprecedented rates, with many citing the church's obsession with money and political power as primary reasons for their departure. They see the disconnect between Christian teachings about love, service, and sacrifice, and the reality of wealthy pastors living in luxury while preaching about faith and humility. Some churches have recognized the problem and attempted reforms. The Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability now provides oversight for member organizations, requiring transparency in financial reporting and limits on executive compensation. However, participation is voluntary, and many of the worst offenders refuse to submit to such oversight. Grassroots reform movements have emerged within various denominations, calling for return to simpler worship styles, increased financial transparency, and greater focus on community service. These movements face significant resistance from established church hierarchies that have become dependent on current financial structures. The legal system has begun to take notice as well. The IRS has increased scrutiny of large church organizations, particularly those involved in political activities or whose leaders live lavishly. Several high-profile investigations have resulted in churches losing their tax-exempt status or facing significant penalties. However, the political influence of wealthy churches makes comprehensive reform difficult. Church leaders who have strayed from their spiritual mission have powerful allies in government who benefit from their support and are reluctant to challenge their practices. The path forward requires honest acknowledgement of how far American churches have drifted from their founding principles. This means confronting uncomfortable truths about the role money and power have played in corrupting religious institutions that millions of Americans still look to for moral guidance. Reform must begin with financial transparency. Churches should be required to publish detailed financial reports showing how donations are used, what leaders are paid, and what percentage of resources goes to community service versus internal operations. Congregants have the right to know whether their contributions are funding gospel outreach or luxury lifestyles. Leadership accountability is equally important. Church boards should be restructured to include more community representatives and fewer major donors. Pastoral compensation should be aligned with community standards rather than corporate executive packages. And churches should be required to demonstrate significant community service to maintain their tax-exempt status. The theological corruption must also be addressed. Seminary education should refocus on spiritual formation and community service rather than business management and marketing. Churches should return to biblical principles of simplicity, service, and sacrifice rather than prosperity and power accumulation. Most importantly, American Christians must decide what kind of religious institutions they want to support. Do they want churches that reflect Jesus' teachings about serving the poor and rejecting material wealth? Or do they prefer religious entertainment complexes that make them feel good about their own prosperity while avoiding challenging spiritual growth? The choice isn't academic. The corruption of American churches has real consequences for millions of people who depend on these institutions for spiritual guidance, community support, and moral leadership. When churches prioritize money and power over their fundamental mission, they abandon the very people they are called to serve. The hour is late, but redemption remains possible. Throughout history, religious institutions have faced similar crises and found ways to reform and renew themselves. The question is whether American churches have the courage to confront their failures and return to the radical message of love, service, and sacrifice that originally inspired them. The answer will determine not just the future of American Christianity, but the role religion plays in addressing the pressing social and economic challenges facing our society. Will churches be part of the solution, serving as advocates for justice and community healing? Or will they remain part of the problem, serving primarily the wealthy and powerful while abandoning their calling to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable? The choice ultimately lies with every person who enters a church sanctuary, drops money in an offering plate, or listens to a religious message. They have the power to demand better from their spiritual leaders and institutions. They have the responsibility to ensure that their faith serves God rather than mammon. The American church stands at a crossroads. Down one path lies continued corruption, declining credibility, and eventual irrelevance. Down the other lies the possibility of redemption, renewal, and return to its foundational mission of serving God through service to others. The path chosen will echo through generations and determine whether American Christianity can reclaim its prophetic voice in a world desperately needing moral leadership. If this deep dive into the intersection of money, power, and faith has given you something to think about, consider supporting our channel with a super thanks. Your support helps us continue exploring the untold stories that shape our understanding of history and society. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember that the most powerful force for change is an informed and engaged citizenry.